In the 20th century, conservation biologists focused largely on protecting our remaining natural lands. These efforts were laudable and should be continued, but they have not been sufficient. In the 21st century, many species across the tree of life are in decline, including many formerly widespread species, and perhaps especially insect species. At the same time, there has been an upswing of interest in pollinator gardening in urban and suburban neighborhoods. So, for the next 12 minutes, I am going to explore the notion of whether these urban gardens could contribute in a significant way to maintaining viable pollinator populations. When I say pollinators in this talk, I will focus on butterflies because we know a lot more about their life histories and population dynamics than other species like native bees and flies. The hypothesis that urban gardens can fully support pollinator populations comes from two observations. The first is that cities have lots of green space. For example, this histogram represents the distribution of green space in 49 US metropolitan regions, ranging from places like San Francisco with about 19% green space to places like Charlotte, North Carolina with more than 70% green space. The second observation is that pollinator populations can persist in highly fragmented landscapes. To estimate butterfly habitat needs, our collaborators and we have used a spatially implicit integral difference equation model to calculate the percent cover of high-quality habitat needed for populations to persist based on field estimates of vital rates like birth, death, and movement. For example, here are calculations for 3 species we have studied extensively over the year. The monarch butterfly, a widespread and highly mobile species, needs less than 0.1% high-quality habitat at landscape scales to persist. At landscape scales, the Baltimore checker spot, a sedentary wetland specialist, needs about 1 to 2% high-quality habitat. And the Fender's blue, an endangered species from the Pacific Northwest, needs landscapes that are 6 to 8% high-quality habitat in order to persist. All of these numbers are only a fraction of the green space in even the most built-up US cities. Of course, not all green space is suitable for pollinator gardens. So next, I will look at how much green space is currently or could be converted to pollinator gardens in my city, Somerville, Massachusetts, which is one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the Boston metropolitan area. To do this, we first mapped every lot in Somerville using Google Street View images. And when I say we, I really mean Atticus Murphy, a PhD student in my lab group. This is the data revolution part of the talk. Can Google images taken at different times of the year and sometimes a few years in the past at coarse resolution relative to actually identifying species really tell us something about the availability of pollinator habitat in the landscape. Specifically, we downloaded images of all addresses in Somerville from Google's API and classified them into 3 categories. Pollinator garden lots were at least 25% pollinator-friendly species, or at least seemed to be in the front yard. Lots with greater than 25% cover of flowering weeds we called pollinator-friendly by neglect, and lots with conventional landscaping that's not pollinator-friendly, like lawns or pavement or stones or mulch, were considered not pollinator-friendly. We're using front yards as a surrogate for whole yards, which is something I'd love to talk more about in the chat. The results are that about 50% of Somerville land is cover. About 50% of Somerville land cover is conventional lots. We had about 0.1% cover of lots that were pollinator friendly by neglect, and about 0.9% cover of lots with significant pollinator gardens. For now, we will ignore the remaining 48% of the city, places like commercial building, large multifamily buildings, public land, and for that matter, Tufts University, and focus on the significance of residential pollinator gardens. But before we do that, we'll look a little bit more closely at the resolution that we got from Google Street View images. So we had an opportunity this summer to ground truth these images, because 2 members of the lab group, Rachel Benowen, a postdoc, and Maria Ostapovich, an undergrad, were unable to do their planned research due to COVID-19 travel restrictions. They decided to stay in Somerville and test our categorizations near campus. They're in the process of visiting 119 lots in Somerville every month, 50 of which are randomly selected pollinator-friendly yards stratified across neighborhoods within Somerville, 50 of which are randomly selected conventional yards stratified across neighborhoods within Somerville, and they're visiting all 19 that we thought were pollinator-friendly by neglect. For what it's worth, we used a double-blind design. We thought it would be fun. We told them which addresses to visit, but not how they were categorized based on Google Street View images. So here are some preliminary results. For each month so far, I'm plotting the percent cover with pollinator-friendly flowers in the graph on the left. And on the right, I'm plotting species richness of plants in flower. That's the number of species that are actually flowering during the survey per yard for box plots across the 3 garden types: conventional, pollinator-friendly by neglect, and pollinator-friendly by design. Letters indicate statistical significance groups from generalized linear models, and the bottom row of pictures are a random selection, literally selected with a random number generator of species they saw during flower during surveys each month. So here we are in May, which is the beginning of the spring flowering season in Massachusetts. At this point in time, all yard types had similar and low flower cover, but gardens classified as pollinator-friendly already had more species in flower per yard. In June, we saw a similar pattern based on statistical significance groups, although there was a non-significant trend towards more cover in pollinator-friendly plots. And finally, by July, we see significantly more cover of pollinator-friendly flowers in flower in gardens that looked pollinator-friendly based on Google Street View images. Okay, so this wouldn't be surprising if we knew what the flowering composition was when we categorized the gardens. The surprising thing is that these very coarse resolution Google Street View images are doing a pretty good job with rapid classification in terms of determining which are actually pollinator friendly. So I'm going to say that this is good evidence that we can go ahead and move forward with these estimates for now. So we can do some back of the envelope calculations. If lots are about 50% yard, Somerville is very densely populated, so maybe only 50% of the yard is plantable. The rest could be like the footprint of the house. And 25% of that is planted with pollinator species. And in Somerville, about 1% of the lots have Somerville pollinator gardens, 1% of the landscape. Then the overall percent of cover in pollinator gardens in Somerville is 0.5 times 0.25 times 0.1, which is about 0.125% habitat. 0.125% might not sound like much, but let's compare it to these butterflies we looked at. 2 of the species I showed you at the beginning of the talk, the Baltimore checker spot and the monarch butterfly, were both known to occur in the Boston metropolitan area in the 20th century. And both of their host plants, turtlehead for checker spots and milkweeds for monarchs, are widely planted in gardens. What you can see is that the Baltimore checker spot habitat requirements are a lot more than the current available habitat, but that the monarch habitat requirements are noticeably less than the current amount of pollinator gardens on the landscape. So I compared these to sightings recorded by the Massachusetts Butterfly Club, a wonderful and active community science group that keeps species lists throughout the summer throughout the state. This is a graph of the percent of the reports of each species statewide that were from the Boston metropolitan area. As our calculations predict, we still regularly see monarch butterflies in the city, but no longer see Baltimore checker spots in the city. There are, of course, a lot of caveats to these calculations, but it's still interesting to speculate. How much would it take to make the city livable again for Baltimore checker spots? Well, my rough guess is that we'd need to go up from about 200 to about 2,000 pollinator garden lots. This would give us 8.9% cover and would eventually lead to 1.1% habitat. In order to do this, we'd need about 1 in 7 lots with currently conventional cover to be converted to at least 25% pollinator cover. That might be an achievable goal. What about a species like the Baltimore checker spot? The Fender's blue butterfly, our third species, does not occur in the Northeast, but we can also ask about how much habitat a similar species would need to persist in a city like Somerville. Baltimore checker spots, Fender's blues, need about 6 to 8% habitat. And in order to get this in Somerville, we'd need to convert all the lots in our study to 12.5% pollinator cover. So maintaining a species like Fender's blue in Somerville only through residential pollinator gardens is probably not realistic. But bearing in mind that we're setting only 12.5% of lots to pollinator habitat and only half of our area is residential, maybe a less densely populated city and less densely built up city could support even at-risk species like the Fender's blue. So in conclusion, I'm cautiously optimistic about the potential role of urban gardens as pollinator habitat, with a few caveats. From an ecological perspective, we need to remember that most butterflies are nectar generalists but host plant specialists. In order for butterflies to persist in the city, at least some gardens need to include the host plant for any particular species of butterflies. It's also possible that pollinator gardens are demographic sinks or ecological traps. Right now, there have been many studies showing how many different species of pollinators are found in urban gardens, but very few studies documenting or evaluating urban habitat quality from a demographic perspective. This would be an important area for future research. We also need to consider the value of these gardens for non-butterfly pollinators, meaning perhaps even more demographic studies with even less well understood species. There are also caveats in terms of human behavior. Specifically, people like autonomy, meaning they don't like being told what to do, they like things that are convenient, and they like doing what's popular. These general broad tendencies mean that pollinator gardening is less amenable to some standard tools in conservation biology than we're used to from wilderness-oriented conservation. For example, careful reserve design algorithms to figure out where to target conservation at landscape scales are not going to be very relevant in the city because individual landowners will be doing what they want. Similarly, careful plans for garden species composition are probably too complicated and difficult for your average residential landowner to follow, or maybe that we just don't like being told what to do. On the other hand, so what we need to do is we need to make pollinator gardening easy and convenient and optimize that subject to as few constraints as possible, rather than trying to optimize it ecologically. At the same time, there may be a possibility to leverage people's tendency to do what is popular. It's interesting to imagine that if pollinator gardening became popular, people might just do it and spend the money they now spend on their lawns on creating pollinator habitat in the city. So to really conclude now, my intuition is to be optimistic about the potential of pollinator gardens for conservation. I'm also excited about moving forward to more rigorously estimate the ecological value of pollinator gardens from a demographic perspective. And I'm really curious about whether this new frontier for urban conservation will significantly change our approach to conservation biology and reverse some of the declines we've seen in recent years. So thank you all very much for listening to these ideas. I also want to thank Atticus Murphy, Rachel Benowen, and Maria Ostapovich for their contributions to the talk. I want to thank our funders, the National Science Foundation and the Department of Defense CERDIP program, for allowing us to keep Rachel and Maria employed during the summer of 2020, even though they couldn't travel to their field sites. Finally, if you have questions, well, I look forward to seeing them online. I'm so sorry we are not all getting together and talking about these kinds of things. I miss you all very much.